it is rare that a scholarly work is able to significantly impact the national conversation. But a recent paper on what has come to be described as the deaths of despair, the increase in deaths among middle-aged white Americans with a high school education, has had a significant impact on the political and policy conversations in this country. Our next guest is co-author of that paper. Ann Cates is the Alexander Stewart 1886 Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs and the Economics Department at Princeton University. She co-authored a paper on this topic with her husband, Angus Deaton, also an economist and recipient this year of the Nobel Prize. Ann Case joins us now to discuss their work. Professor Case, thanks so much for coming on the program.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
Thank you. And I guess one of the first questions I wanted to ask you before we get into the details of this study, did you have any idea when you went in to look at these mortality rates what a compelling story they would tell, or indeed that they would tell a story at all?
Well, I think neither of us had any idea. We started kind of around the edges. We were looking at pain on one side of it to see what was happening to pain among middle-aged Americans. And for a very different project, we had started looking at suicide just to see whether or not the suicide numbers would corroborate numbers on people's self-reported happiness. But as we started to look at the numbers and we started to look, say, back in time and realize that there were really serious changes going on, we started to dig deeper. And when we got to the point where we realized that all-cause mortality, so mortality from any cause, among whites in middle age were beginning to rise, and that is something that was totally unexpected, especially given that it had been falling for 50 years. It continues to fall in all of the other kind of comparison sister countries to the U.S. So it was a total surprise for us.
One of the things that I think was striking for some of us hearing about this study is that for many of us, we've had a belief, particularly if we've been alive for a while in the United States, had the belief that life expectancy is one of those ever-improving situations. As you say, we've had 50 years of improvement. I think the assumption somehow was that this was going to continue to improve as medicine got better and as technology got better and so on. So I think one of the reasons, there are a number of reasons why this study, I think, has had such an impact, but I think one of the reasons is that it feels as if it challenged a deeply held assumption on the part of the American people about the optimistic nature or the optimistic prospects for the future of this country. So I know we're getting a little afield from the data, and I want to get back to the data, but did that strike you as well, or do you have any thoughts on that?
It certainly did, and I'm afraid I have to be academic here for a second, which is that life expectancy continues to improve. Because life expectancy, it takes place, it's a snapshot over all ages. So what we're talking about is actually death in middle age, so really the mortality rates in middle age. And those had been falling at about 2% a year for the last 50 years. And so, and I think, and again, this is getting a little bit ahead of the data, but I think that people in the U.S. anticipate that their lives are going to be better, that their children's lives will be even better than their lives. And certainly one big component of that is how long they're going to well and how long they're going to live and how well they're going to be while they live. And so the idea that starts to move in the wrong direction, I think, is the reason that it really got a lot of people's attention.
Yes, and to be clear, Professor Case, and we're talking with Ann Case, co-author of the study on the increasing death rates for middle-aged, high school-educated white Americans. While these statistics are getting worse for this particular group of people, for other groups of people, they may be continuing to improve, but their baselines are may be different. For example, for minority Americans and so on, correct?
That's exactly right. So African Americans started the late 1990s with a much higher mortality rate in middle age than did, say, white non-Hispanics. But their mortality rates have been falling quite dramatically and continue to do so. So, for example, the Centers for Disease Control every year report on the gap between white and black life expectancy or white and black mortality rates, and that gap has been closing. But part of the reason that gap has been closing is because the mortality rates of whites have been going up since the late 1990s. Hispanics, and I think this comes as a surprise to a lot of people who don't look at these sorts of numbers, Hispanics actually have had lower mortality rates than non-Hispanic whites for the last 20 years, and their rates continue to fall at about 2% a year. So it's really this white non-Hispanic group that's seen this dramatic increase. And
It's not just if I may jump in here, it's not just the increase in mortality, but it's the cause of death that is so striking.
The causes of death that are actually leading the way here, which, as you said, deaths of despair, suicide, drug overdose, either prescription drug or illegal drugs, and alcohol-related diseases, so alcoholic liver disease and cirrhosis. And all three of them have been climbing since the late 1990s. And in fact, for drug overdoses and suicides, those mortality rates have gone up for every education group. But it's just that when you put together all of the numbers, the all-cause mortality is big enough to drive that up for people with a high school degree or less. People with some college, their all-cause mortality has been flat over this period, and people with a college degree, 4-year college degree or more, their all-cause mortality rates are falling, but only slightly, much slower than, say, the countries in Europe, much slower than Hispanic Americans. So all white non-Hispanics seem to be touched by this, but indeed it's concentrated among people with a high school degree or less.
So if I'm to understand correctly, these problems are rising for all groups of whites, but it is this cohort, the middle-aged whites with a high school education, where death rates overall are increasing. So that's what makes that group stand out the most?
That's what I think the standout is. That's, I think, part of what got people's attention was the fact that this problem, which everyone had heard rumblings about, obviously, but that it was big enough that it was actually driving up the all-cause mortality rates. Yeah.
And now we reach a point, I guess, where there's the data and then there's what might or might not be inferred from the data. And I recognize that we don't know what we don't know. But having said that, you yourself have written that we can only speculate about whether rising economic inequality plays a role in the increasing disparity among those who died from deaths of despair, but you have noted that while lower skilled jobs have also declined in European nations, they have not experienced the same kind of rise in deaths among middle-aged people. So that leads one to wonder, is that a matter of the social safety net? Is it a matter of the general tenor of the society in which they're living versus our society? Is it a combination of factors? What are your thoughts on that?
I have many thoughts on that, but I'll also repeat that at this point, we can speculate, and certainly a lot of people have speculated. I mean, I think people look at these results, and it's sort of a Rorschach test of sorts, that people see this and they say, "Aha, this is the reason why." So we will do a lot more work on this, but I think here are the working hypotheses about why things might be different in Europe. As you say, they have a much stronger social safety net. There's universal health care, which probably makes a big difference. There are still defined benefit pension plans instead of defined contribution pension plans, which also means as people move toward retirement, they're more secure in terms of what they will have to live on. It's also the case, though, that the Europeans have been much more careful about allowing heavy-duty prescription opioids to be prescribed to patients for pain. And while we think that the epidemic of opioid overdose is really just a proximate cause, there must be deeper causes that people have turned to those. As a proximate cause, it's clear that the fact that it was very easy to get a prescription to a drug that was stronger than morphine on a regular basis has been one of the things that has caused mortality rates to rise for this subpopulation in the U.S. And the Europeans have been much stricter in terms of their opioid prescription policies. So we think that those factors probably both play a role. It's also possible that in the U.S., whites had a particular narrative for their lives about the way their lives would go, about their ability to get ahead, about their children's ability to get ahead. And then when manufacturing jobs were exported in very large numbers, when the kinds of jobs that they could get with a high school degree did not include on-the-job training, did not include good benefits, and they don't see themselves in a position where they could actually even apply for jobs that would lead to something better, that might be part of the problem here as well.
It strikes me, Professor Ann Case, in looking at this whole issue of the white deaths of despair, that in order to probe, really try to get further with it, I know this economists feel they can solve every problem, but it seems like a classic kind of a topic for interdisciplinary study, because there are medical dimensions to this problem, there are psychological dimensions to this problem, sociological dimensions, as well as economic. Is there any thought going forward about I'm not an advocate for or against interdisciplinary studies per se, but is there any thought as to how to involve other disciplines in this going forward?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking right now with colleagues of ours in the anthropology department who have worked with populations that have struggled, and we're thinking about doing joint work. So hypotheses and data, and some of the data helping to drive the questions that might be asked, but then to go out and do ethnographic work to try to see what role do churches play. Do they play the same roles that they used to play? Bob Putnam has a new book where he looks at people and people's sense of where their lives are going and where their children will go. So we think sociology, anthropology, good ethnographic work, and certainly the medical community as well. I mean, a part of our paper that didn't get a lot of attention, but we think is quite important, is that we were able to report on the fact that it's not just mortality. People in middle age are reporting themselves in worse health. They have more pain.
Yes.
They have more mental distress.
I was looking at that. I was looking at that table right now. As you were saying that they're reporting more mental health problems, the activities of daily living, are walking and so on, climbing stairs, that there seem to be increases there as well, which gets into the whole question of the relationship between emotional well-being, physical well-being, which causes which, those sorts of things, right?
Those sorts of things, and those things I think are central. I mean, one of the columns or rows in that table talks about how much difficulty people have socializing, and we know that social isolation is a trigger for suicide. Pain is a trigger for suicide. And we know that we don't really fully understand the connection between stress, anxiety, pain, and people's the choices people make when they're feeling those things. So, and the kind of how connected people feel. One of the things that we want to push forward on is, say, marital status. Unfortunately, on death records, it doesn't ask, were you connected with a church? It doesn't ask, were you living close to your children? But there are other ways into that question, and I think all of those need to be pursued.
And, one last observation I'd love to run by, and we're talking with Ann Case, professor of economics and co-author of this study on mortality that received a great deal of attention recently, which is your study rightfully, I think, has been embraced by people on the left who find it meaningful and something worth discussing. But there's also a tendency, and I will say that as a self-identified person of the left, there is a tendency at times, I think, to dismiss the plight of middle-class white people, middle-aged white people, and without denigrating anybody or dismissing the critical issues of race and other matters in this country. What strikes me underlying all the data you and Professor Deaton have unearthed is it's a terribly sad story.
Isn't it? It is a terribly sad story, and I think that both on the left and on the right, there are candidates in 2016 who are trying to reach out to these people who feel like they've been invisible for a very long time. And I think that the kind of economic pressure, the kind of disintegration possibly in social networks that people have lived with now for 10, 20, 30 years and can eventually erode away at people's bodies, at people's sense of self, and people's mental well-being. And I think that both the left and the right are tapping into that in this election cycle going on now.
And obviously there are two ways to do that. One is by dividing, and I would argue that one presidential candidate is doing that, and the other is by pointing out the commonalities of interest that people in many different groups share economically and otherwise, and I would argue that another candidate is doing that. But in any case, it's very, very compelling, and as we see in the news just this week, it is dangerous. It can create social instability when a group feels despair and no hope for the future. So I think the study that you and Angus Deaton have done and continue to do in this area is very, very important. And Ann Case, I thank you very much for coming on the program.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much, Richard.